Hi, my name is Matthew Belisario. Welcome to another edition of the Belisario Sonic YouTube channel. Today I'm starting a short series of 3 videos on the history of recorded music. And I think this will be a lot of fun for those of you out there who collect records, who love recorded music, and who can appreciate where the modern record came from. So that's what I'm going to be focusing on the next 3 videos. And this first video is going to be talking about primarily the Edison invention of the cylinder record phonograph, if you will. And I'm going to talk about that. There would be, of course, that would precede the 78 rotating disc that I'll talk about in the next video. But on this, before I get to this guy, before I talk about the cylinder record, I want to talk about the first recorded music ever in the history of mankind. And that would come from what would be called the invention of the phonautograph by a guy I had never heard of until recently, whose name was Edward Leon Scott de Martinville, who invented this contraption, the phonautograph, in 1854. And this is pretty interesting because really you're going to have your first record collector, if you will, that would come from these recordings. But these recordings are quite different in that the guy that invented this had no way of playing them back, and they looked something like this. And what's kind of fun about this story is this typesetter, de Martinville, wanted to figure out a way to take the sound waves of a recording of a song and have a way to put them down on something that could be recorded. And so he came up with this. And I'm just going to briefly talk to you about this before I move right here into the cylinder record. This right here is an interesting story on how this guy did this. And what's interesting about it is that in 2008, we actually were able to decode these and read these and play them back. So this is pretty cool. Here's how he described his invention. He said, I cover a plate of glass with an exceedingly thin stratum of lamp black. And that was like a soot-looking dust of ink that we put over this glass. Above it, I fix an acoustic trumpet with a membrane the diameter of a 5-franc coin at its small end, and the physiological tympanum, or the eardrum. I would affix at its center a stylus, which would be your first stylus ever made. It was made of a boar's bristle, about 1 centimeter or more in length, fine but rigid. He said, I carefully adjust the trumpet so the stylus barely grazes the lamp black. Then as the glass plate slides horizontally in a well-formed groove at a speed of 1 meter per second, one speaks into the horn. The trumpet's opening causes the membranes to vibrate and the stylus to trace the figures. He says, gentlemen, he's very excited about this invention. We're in the presence of an invention being born, an entirely new graphic art springing from the heart of physics, of physiology, and mechanics. Each trace of speech that I submit today analyzes the voice, its tonality, its intensity, its timbre. I believe that a synthesis is also possible through which the tracing of words is transformed into a series of signs by mechanical means, and I propose to attempt it. I see the book of nature open before the gaze of all men, and however small I may be, I dare to hope to be permitted to read it. Now, what was unfortunate was he was never able to read these back, so he made a big collection of these recordings, and a guy named Charles N. Banker would die with a collection of 30 of these. And I believe they were framed. He had them on his wall, and they were a collection of recordings with the song listed below it and this phonautograph. So I think that's kind of a cool story. Now, what's even more interesting, if you go online, you can find these. Actually, if you go on YouTube and you type in phonautograph recordings of Au Clair de la Lune, which was the name of the song. It was recorded on April 9th, 1960. You can hear this recording. It's pretty awful sounding, but what's really cool about it, and this guy was pretty smart, because if you see below the actual recording of his voice, he actually recorded the tuning fork along it with it, which gave the proper pitch, so that when you went back, he figured somebody later on would be able to figure this out. They could go back and accurately measure the passage of time, determine the pitch of the sound recorded here on this phonautograph by the actual tuning fork, which is simultaneously here traced right along with it, which is pretty neat. So by counting its squiggles in the soot an experimenter can determine exactly how much time it elapsed at any point during the recording. And these also got put on the page, if you will. So that is your history of your first recorded music, which I think is pretty fascinating. But now let's move on to this Edison disc. Now, there were other people also experimenting with this besides Edison, but Edison was the first guy in 1877 to form a company that was able to take a phonograph and bring it to the market. So he gets credit really as the creator of the phonograph. Now, of course, Columbia would also step in to this very soon. You'd have competition there, and if you go on eBay, you'll see that the two most common cylinders you'll find are going to be the Edison and the Columbia. The Edison Record phonograph company was formed on October 8th, 1877. The first cylinders were made of foil, so they wore out really quickly. And the way that they were played, you had a cylinder here. This is going to be one that would be a little bit later, and actually the last ones that would be made by the Edison Company. This was a 1914 cut here. But what the first wax cylinders that Edison made were white. They were made of Saracen beeswax and stearic wax. And these only held 2 minutes of music. But some other things that Edison came out with were dolls, talking dolls that had actually wax cylinders, tiny wax cylinders that played back. And those are worth a lot of money. They're on eBay as well. But the guy that he was partnered up with was more interested in business propositions. He was looking at dictation in jukeboxes. And so you'd have your first proto jukeboxes that would be developed out of this Edison cylinder idea. And this would, of course, pique people's interest in having their own in their house later on. But unfortunately, these little jukebox things that they made that they would put in different places, like restaurants or what have you, they didn't work very well, and it took a lot of maintenance to keep them running, and people would put their money in and it wouldn't play, and so that became a problem. But there were, as I said, Columbia had also entered the game with their parent, what would become Columbia, and there was a lot of people suing each other. There were legal battles going on, and Edison figured that the best way he could get around this was to declare bankruptcy. So in 1894, he declares bankruptcy, and he enables him to get the rights back to his invention. And so he wasn't allowed to make another phonograph until 1896, in which he starts the National Phonograph Company, and he would start making these for entertainment use. And so the standard cylinders then were 4 1/4 long, a little over 2 inches in diameter. They cost 50 cents, and they played about 120 RPMs. And back then, you had to crank yourself. There was no spring, no motor, so you had to sit there and actually get the right speed yourself in order to get the right sound out of the cylinder. So it was very primitive when it first started out. But the cylinder really had 3 problems. One, there was no way to mass produce these at the time. All these were one-offs. All the early ones were one-offs. And so you had to record every time you wanted the recording. You had to get the guy in there and record another recording, and to make the master, the cylinder, which was there were no masters or anything being made because there was no mass production. So you'd have the actual cylinder sitting there, the guy speaking in or singing, and it would cut right onto this cylinder, and that would be what you would sell. Now, obviously, that was a problem. There was also only 2 minutes of music on this guy, so it was very limiting. And then third, they were Hill and Dale cuts. So that means they were cut this way versus lateral like you would see on a record. And so there's only so much volume you can get out of it. And although arguably the last of these made, like this Blue Amberol, had better sound quality than the 78s for quite a while, these still had the issue of a volume problem. But Edison did start to get the idea, I'm going to make a bigger cylinder so that I can get a louder volume off of it. And he came up with a 4 1/4 inch long and 5 inch diameter cylinder in 1899, and the player cost $125, which is huge back then. $4 for a cylinder, and they quit making them over about 10 years because people couldn't afford them and they just couldn't get the price down. Now they did come up with a process for mass producing cylinders, and that was around 1901 or so when they were able to mold these. So you had basically a master, you had a submaster, and then you had what the customer holds in their hand, like this guy. and it was called the molded process. The process that Edison called these records was gold molded, because the gold vapor was given off by the gold electrodes used in the process. So you had this gold master, and then you had submasters that were created from the gold master, and then these cylinders that you play on your record player at home were made from these molds. From a single mold, you had about 120 to 150 cylinders that could be made, and then the new wax was now black, and they were called new high-speed hard wax molded records, which would soon be called gold molded. If you go online and you look at the cases of these that came in these cylinder cases, they would say gold molded on them. So you also had the cost came down on these. People were able to start buying them. They're about 35 cents a piece. They started beveling the edges, and you've got the name here. This is called Lorena, is the name of the song on this guy, and you can see it here on the edge there if you can read that. But also Edison got in 1905, started getting back into dictation systems, and that was a big thing and would come into play later, because these companies, Victor, Columbia, and Edison, would all be involved in dictation, different kinds of business enterprises. And so you would, the first one, you had basically a executive dictating machine, then you had a secretarial machine, and then you had a machine that would go and scrape these. They would basically shave these down when they were done, and you could recycle them. Now, what Edison did, though, is came up with an Amberol record, and that was right before this blue Amberol came out. That, however, would be finer cuts here, and that would give you 4 minutes of music versus 2. And that was a big deal, because now you could start putting 4 minutes on here, and you can start being able to put, longer songs on there. And still, of course, primitive by our ideas, but you can see here these fine grooves on here. So what Edison does, though, however, is he continues to improve these, while Columbia jumps off. Victor steps into the market, and we're going to talk about in the next video the 78s. Columbia would jump ship in about 1909 and stop making these in 1912. Victor, of course, came out, and they basically started doing the record. We're going to talk about that. But what was interesting about this is the last Victor or the last Edison disc that would be made would be this blue Amberol. These were started in 1913. Edison doubled down on it, even though he would also start producing records, which we'll talk about. He'll start producing the disc. But 1913, these come out. This is a 1914. These were called the Indestructible record. Unbreakable cylinder. They had great sound quality. They were the best probably sounding records on the market at the time. So audiophiles, I guess, would have been excited, even though there really wasn't what we think about today as an audiophile market. But these sounded really good. And actually, Edison's big marketing statement was, these sound better than 78. Stick with the cylinders. Stick with the cylinders. These sound better. And in fact, they did sound better for quite a while. He did come up with a really solid cylinder here. So these would be made all the way up until 1929, when Edison would go out of business. And so even though he made records, which the diamond discs records that you can see those on eBay as well, and we're going to talk about those on the next video. The 78 would eventually take over, and these guys would go by the wayside. And by 1929, Edison was out of business. Columbia had already quit making them, and these guys were pretty much on the way out. So let me just show you a little bit more about these, because these are interesting. They came with little liner notes. So check this out. Got the name of the song. On the inside, you got lyrics. And then over here, you got liner notes on the recording. So pretty cool. Pretty little cool piece of history. This came stuck in there. And you got your record, that cylinder that slides in. And on the cap, you've got the name of the song and the catalog number. And this one happens to be, I think, 2400 and 1914 recording. If you go on Discogs or other websites, you will see a catalog listing of what year they were all made. I don't have any way to play this, but fortunately on YouTube, you can actually go play the song and hear what it sounds like. So that's pretty cool. So, all right, well, this 15 minutes, I think it's probably long enough. And then the next video we're going to go into is going to be into the 78 record. And then we're going to get into the 33 RPM on a third video, because I want to cover some controversial issues on the speed of a 33 and a third on that one. All right, take care.